engineering, although not always. Email, and I would say probably upwards of 80%. If email is the inbound vector, it is an attachment, but certainly we've seen links as well as the non-passive drive-bys where, let's say, an ad is placed in Facebook or something like that, where it does some redirect and the payload is delivered. But then also, more and more, we're seeing, particularly in sophisticated variants, that there is a technical vulnerability that is exploited, perhaps a known vulnerability in Windows or Cisco or something like that, where the adversary can gain entry to the network and then manually establish a beachhead there and manually execute the process and perhaps do some other fingerprinting and surveillance as well. So it does not always start with social engineering and email attachments, although that is the vast majority in terms of our experience. The next, so there's a couple of interesting things that are going on here. More and more often, the payload will transition to memory resident and then it will self-delete, and does a pretty good job of that. In fact, in many of the cases, even through forensic investigation, the binaries are difficult to find. They're difficult to locate because there are secure wiping mechanisms in this self-deleting function. But very often as well, there's local binaries where the payload is assembled after execution, registered auto run, of course. So early on, I'm thinking 2 years ago when we first started to see ransomware in the wild, the initial advice was to power the computer down, and that no longer works for the vast majority of cases unless you're booting to a controlled environment, because the payload is actually, the binary is set to auto run. It will spawn other processes, of course, things like disabling or terminating antivirus, disabling backups, disabling other things like Bluetooth or other security mechanisms, like even we've seen multi-factor, like biometric multi-factor authentication disabled as well. And the idea is that to the best of its ability, it wants to operate undisrupted. And so it does whatever it can to preserve its own pristine environment. It may, so the initial payload, which tends to be a small stub, may also idle, again, to circumvent antivirus and other IDS-type mechanisms. And I mentioned the auto-deletion of the binary itself. More and more, we're seeing that where these payloads are operating almost exclusively in memory, and obviously harder to deal with at that point. Also, from an attribution standpoint, once something is memory resident, attribution becomes a little bit more difficult because capturing the forensic image requires an additional step. It's not impossible, but it requires a little bit more work. Step 3, so actually step 2B, so this was inserted not that long ago, but in the case where there are small environments where automation and deleting of backup files or backup processes can be done automatically, we've seen those functions built into certain variants, but we've also seen instances where the adversary, through a known exploit or a compromised credential or access to the network otherwise, will log into a compromised account, begin to execute the ransomware process, prevents a complete disaster. And so to better ensure to improve the chances that they'll receive a ransom payment, they go into better ensure, sometimes that requires pivoting through the network, just a little bit of surveillance. You got to any organization that has taken some preemptive measures to deter ransomware or these types of attacks may have offline backups, and so it takes a little longer. But we're seeing more and more of this, where the backups themselves are targeted first before the payload executes. On to step 3, there's typically a small stub that's downloaded initially, or as the binary is created. It's just a small packer, unpacker. So one of the first things it's going to do, typically after it idles for some period of time, is it contacts command and control, of course grabs the key, and then begins the assemblage of the final binary that will do the encryption itself. And there's some interesting, without getting into the forensic aspects of this, there are some interesting techniques in use for downloading and unpacking and assembling that do a very good job of avoiding or eluding any type of IDS or antivirus, even other types of endpoint protection that are looking for specific behaviors or analytics. So then, of course, the execution where the encryption starts, it's looking for specific files, and it's actually pretty smart. Keep in mind that for the ransomware to be most effective, it needs to, as quickly as possible and without disruption, encrypt all important files or files that would be worth something to a business. So they've gotten smarter. They're not out there encrypting everything or doing a full disk. They're actually going through the file system and traversing the file system and looking for specific extensions, because there's no sense encrypting DLLs, right? Those can be easily recovered in 100 different ways. This is about PowerPoints and financial documents and PDFs, and so if it wants to move through that storage device as quickly as possible, it's going to skip over anything that is of low worth or worthless. So smart on their part. I've also seen where the payload is smart enough to figure out, well, are the drives mapped? Are there removable devices? Or is there a cloud service? There's a Dropbox. And so we're starting to see more of a transition to awareness around the different storage options that exist, and it just makes the payload more effective. So step 5, encrypt. Here's some actual code that we captured from a case. To be honest, I don't even remember which variant or version this was, but it's pretty simple. When you go and reverse engineer this, the code is actually small, it's tight, it's fairly well written, but it's very simple. There's just not a whole lot to it. And very common now to see a dialog box like this. This is an actual screenshot from one a couple years ago. And then they're more and more commonly, it's just a text file. And anytime that someone opens a file that has been encrypted, that now has a new extension and is mapped to a specific binary to open, it opens up Word or Notepad, usually Notepad as text file, and basically displays the ransom note in a standard Windows binary. Directions for decrypting, so for accessing keys for making the Bitcoin payments are usually pretty accessible. I've seen them get a little bit sloppy in the sense that when they've done such a great job with packing, unpacking encryption, writing tight code, and then the translation from Russian or whatever to English is sloppy, it makes it harder for these victims to actually make the payment. And I think because they're so used to dealing in Bitcoin, they make some assumptions on whether or not their victims are capable of even buying Bitcoin and paying in that form of payment. And so we've seen some sloppy translations, and we've seen some sloppy ransom notes as well. That it's just a bit of a mystery to us. But here's an example of one. And then, what the end result, of course, doesn't always look like this. Very often, there's a common file extension. In this case, this was clearly a randomization of the file names. Excuse me, randomization of the file names, and it becomes obvious that something has gone wrong with your computer. And double-clicking any one of these will redirect to that ransom note. A couple more examples here. Here's one where it repurposed the .mp3 extension, which was then mapped to Notepad to open the instructions as well. So I'm going to show you some analysis that we did. Let me see here. Give me 1 second. Okay. For whatever reason, this link isn't working, and I don't want to switch out to a browser at the moment. You'll all have access to these slides, and so you can copy and paste this link into your own browser. Essentially, this is the malware attribution and the signature and behavior analysis that was in there, and you can see a pretty simple payload. It was, I think, an earlier version of Tesla Crypt. It was basically randomizing file names. It randomized its own file name. And the behaviors were typical command and control, where it was out talking to about a dozen different servers, known bad IPs, where it was doing everything from downloading and assembling to capturing key information. And it became very clear that the randomization in the binary was tied directly to an algorithm on the command and control servers, because there were domains in there that looked like normal businesses, and then there were some other ones that were completely random. And generally speaking, we're not a law enforcement organization, and so once we get to a resolved incident, we leave it to the FBI or to someone else to do attribution at that level. But you can see where there were a couple of established businesses whose public-facing websites or web servers were compromised in dealing as part of a botnet as well. So what do we do about this? The real sort of million-dollar question today is, ransomware is on everyone's mind, and so what do we do about this? So let me talk about a few things. I'm actually going to reference a new open-source effort that has been put in place, and in fact, I'll actually include that with the slides here so that everyone has access to that. But it breaks it down by variant and by version, the types of preventative measures. So if you reverse engineer each one of these different variants and you understand attribution and the signatures there, it talks about specifically the types of technical controls that you should focus on. I'm going to talk more generally about ransomware in general. The first, of course, some basic things here. As it turns out, eliminating local admin or administrative privileges for end users disables about 90% of the authorization that's required to execute many of these different services and functions that ransomware relies on. And so that is one sweeping change, of course, that it eliminates a lot of issues. This seems like a no-brainer, but you'd be surprised how often this is not done. But doing smart filtering at your gateway, your email gateway, and in your email system, or even at the desktop, these things are some fundamentals that are often overlooked. There's a couple of folders that ransomware prefers, particularly the app data folder, and so by disabling just through some GPO or another restriction, disabling binaries from executing in these folders and these paths disables another significant percentage of these executables. And then, of course, there's some basic email and email type protections, technical services that can both authenticate the end user and the sender of the email. Things like certificates as well tend to eliminate some of the chaff that arrives via email. And so these things tend to be pretty effective. Blocking international IPs is one that is of questionable value these days, just because these botnets, I mean, half the compromised endpoints or nodes in a botnet are in the United States anyway. And so if the end source of the intrusion is an American IP, this is ineffective. But it's generally easy to do, so low-hanging fruit, so to speak. Macros, we've seen situations where the initial intrusion, patient 0, was a Microsoft Word or an Excel file that was loaded with VB script, and so disabling those macros tends to eliminate as well. Again, something that's easily done through GPO, and not often needed as well. Most organizations aren't using macros, and so by disabling those, you essentially eliminate another significant percentage. I crossed out avoid mapping drives because today, generally any storage that's accessible by the operating system, regardless of the access type, is generally accessible to ransomware. And so this has really gone to our recommendation of having some type of offline backup. And so even if even if it's inappropriate or unreasonable to have I'm not even sure what you would do honestly today, but for a file share to be accessible to a normal network, you've got to do some type of mapping, or there's some type of file system activity going on there, and it's almost impossible to avoid, because once the operating system knows about it, then the resident payload also knows about it. So in this case, the offline element, or the backup element, is about having a backup that's inaccessible to the network. Write access, of course. If you're doing access controls and authorization appropriately, privileges, role-based access controls, those kinds of things. If someone doesn't need write access to a directory, then they shouldn't have it. This is sort of a fundamental here, but we've seen where smaller organizations, because they were able to manage their Active Directory and their access controls more effectively, actually limited the spread of the ransomware, just because the individual user, and it was that service, it was that account under which the binary was run, it didn't have access to certain map drives or write access to map drives, and so it didn't work. This is pretty straight up. This is a no-brainer for a lot of different incidents, but most organizations generate very little outbound traffic, and so a simple deny all for most is effective. There's a very few reasons to allow outbound traffic today, and so that's a general sort of a response recommendation, not just for ransomware. Antivirus, believe it or not. So depending on the variant, we've all sort of gotten used to the fact that the development and release of malware today is largely automated. So it's very easy to create a completely new binary with a different hash and different signatures. But that said, you got to have antivirus. I mean, even though it's only about 30% effective on most common malware today, that 30% represents a huge number. It's literally hundreds of millions of signatures that are known to your antivirus. And it doesn't matter which one; they generally all produce about 30% efficacy. So as long as you're using one, you're keeping it up to date, then you're in better shape than you were. Although obviously we can't rely on it today. We've also seen that just blocking ads straight up, like don't even allow the ad, including its own script and these iframes and things like that, tends to eliminate almost all of the what I'll call non-passive drive-by, where you're essentially you have to click a link which activates the download and the execution of the payload as well. So blocking ads, I mean, also seems like a no-brainer here, but it's pretty effective. A little more sophisticated is in a few organizations that had been hit in a way that it was severe and impactful, and they were willing to invest in some things that were nearly foolproof, are these things called canary files, where you place a document or a file on a drive that would likely be hit first. A lot of them go alphabetically through map drives, and then they go alphabetically through the file system. And so if you have a drive, you map an A drive, basically, and then you have a file called A.AAA. When that file gets encrypted, you've got scripts that are monitoring that file that can say, hey, listen, the very first file is encrypted. It looks like we're under attack. It looks like ransomware is present in our network. And so you can actually send immediate notifications. And the reality is there's nothing that ransomware can do about this, because you can name it anything you want. You can put it anywhere you want. Or the payload to do discovery on a canary file would be completely I won't say impossible, but so expensive and time-consuming that it wouldn't work with it. And so the act of encrypting that document triggers the alert, and so it's actually a very effective defense if you have the infrastructure and the people to respond to those types of alerts. The script can also disconnect map drives. It can do a number of other things in an automated way that would minimize the scope or the access of that payload itself as well. You know, I'd say I'm guessing that this audience is largely technical, but none of these technical controls compare to an effective awareness program and a user base that is not only educated and motivated to identify social engineering types attacks or something that looks fishy, right? If you see something, say something. The return on investment in awareness training and education and testing is so far greater than any technical control we've ever seen. The issue right now is that the data is right in front of us. If you ask the average cybersecurity expert or CISO or anyone who's involved in the security industry, they'll all agree that people are the greatest risk. Right? Every single cybersecurity risk comes down to a person without exception. And even though we know this, we're doing very little to counter that. And I think largely because early awareness efforts failed because we had security people trying to do psychology things and they weren't good at it. Organizations, including executive management, not understanding that there is a people component, a very large people component to cybersecurity, and being unwilling to move away from technology, right? Technology tends to feel like the blue pill where it's, you just take this and you lose 20 pounds. There are a number of factors today in cybersecurity that have kept us from really pursuing an effective awareness condition at most businesses. However, that's it. That's the key. If you're looking for a silver bullet, this is about as silver as it gets. And so encourage you to think beyond technical controls and backups in terms of prevention and restoration. This is a people issue. Ransomware doesn't just show up on your network. Your people put it there. And so if we want to achieve any level of success with this or any other type of incident, we've got to get to the point where we're creating a culture of security. This is about people, creating soldiers and advisors and discoverers in your people, giving them easy tools to report, giving them education so they can identify, and then recognizing them when they do a good job. This is it. So if you take away one slide out of this presentation, it's about building a culture of security that results in lasting, meaningful behavioral change in your end users. So what do you do when this thing shows up? My guess is that many of you have already experienced this firsthand. So I'm going to cover a couple of things. The first is this: the Achilles heel of ransomware is that it can be contained. And so anything you can do to interrupt communications, not assets that have already begun the encryption process or are already demonstrating indicators of compromise, the dialog box, ransom notes, those are already gone. So don't focus on those. We want to interrupt the communications, right? If we think about the kill chain, so to speak, and I hate the buzzword, but if we think about how this thing works, it needs to propagate through file shares and other communications mechanisms. If those are interrupted, you've effectively contained it to a point where now you can do discovery on specific assets and respond there locally, rather than wondering, well, where has this thing gone? Cut it off at the pass, so to speak. Don't forget that wireless and Bluetooth are other propagation methods as well. Communicating to your end users is critical. We're going to do some things technically to provide some backstops for them, but they need to know immediately that the organization is is experiencing a ransomware attack, and that they should do certain things, and that those certain things may change depending on the intrusion itself. But this is all about containment, and the faster you can detect and interrupt those communications, the better, really, because In many cases, there are variants of, and certainly in some cases, there are variants of ransomware that if they cannot commute outbound to the internet, they effectively stop. Some of these lower, sort of, I'll call them garden variety of variants, aren't smart enough to continue with a local key. And so if it can't communicate to its CNC, it effectively just stops. So if we can kill the internet quickly, if we can kill local communications channels as well, that has been very effective. In terms of eradication recovery, restore points tend to not work as well today because the more common variants are they're smart enough to focus on any type of backup or native recovery tools like restore points and online backup files. That said, it is a method that you can pursue. We want to make sure that if we believe that patient zero in the initial point of entry was email, that we are either disabling email completely, or we are, if we've got signatures and we know what the hash looks like, that we're going through and cleaning out inboxes of anyone that has an executable or an attachment that matches those signatures, that binary. I've never seen this work, but I've heard that it has. So obviously the ransomware, the ransom note will give you instruction. We'll say, hey, listen, you've got 7 days to comply. After 7 days, the price doubles. You have another 7 days, after which we're deleting the key. Locally, by rolling back the system clock, you may actually be able to get more time. Your mileage varies on that. And I'd say, obviously, that's a time-consuming process. So even if it does work, and I think it's low likelihood, you should focus on classified or critical assets first, right? Don't worry about endpoints so much. And then, of course, the basics, right? Making sure that we're not trying to eradicate, in a classical sense, any malware from an asset. This is about wiping and recovering. These days, with imaging technologies, it's become faster, and we have certainly much higher confidence in eradication if we've just done a low-level wipe and recover from a backup or an image. So, dealing with incidents of all different types, there are times where we hear ransomware and we kind of breathe a sigh of relief. There are some things that, there are some silver linings here. The first is, generally speaking, they are after ransom and nothing else. If you look at the most recent HHS guidance for healthcare organizations, even ransomware does not automatically assume or determine that there has been a breach. And so, of course, while burden of proof is on the victim, there are ways to prove that the organization, even if they've had a significant ransomware attack, that they have not been breached. There are ways to do that through forensics and attribution, and really having an attorney who understands the language in that guidance. In fact, the large case that we're working today, my sense is that they will not declare a breach, even though there was obviously certainly access to it. The precedent that was set was if there's any unauthorized access to things like PII, PHI, your CDE for credit cards, that constituted an unauthorized access. And in some ways you can prove that technically, but the guidance and court precedent has made it a little bit more gray. And so generally speaking, we feel confident in ransomware that we can almost always prove that there's been no exfiltration of data, and the compromise is limited to a technical one and a local one, and which does not constitute a breach. Also, there aren't too many incidents where just pulling a network cable will stop an incident in its tracks, right? If you've got an employee, if you've got some third party, an adversary who has access to your network, whether it's through remote access or other backdoors or compromised credentials, there's almost always more than one way in. From a ransomware standpoint, it's almost that easy, where as long as you're disrupting the communications channels, it's I won't say easy, I want to be careful, but it's simple. Maybe not easy, but it is simple to defeat because of the inherent nature of the payload and its behaviors. As I mentioned earlier, the average response time is 3 days. Usually, as long as an organization has some type of backup, imaging and restoration isn't a time-consuming process. Much of it can be automated, and so it's typically results in a short-term impact. Again, not always. Really depends. It's case by case. It's different, but usually there's a short-term impact here. And then lastly, of course, it's sort of the "I told you so" here, which is these technical controls. Most of them, whether it's access or authentication, segmenting your network, isolation, these are things you should have been doing in the first place. So in a lot of cases, we've seen a small ransomware attack motivate an organization to kickstart their cybersecurity program in ways that they should have been doing already anyway. So I guess if you can call that a silver lining, it is. I'll throw a couple of tools up here that we use for some of this. Actually, this Foolish IT Crypto Prevent does some pretty cool things, and it's easy to deploy. So for end users who are, let's say, less managed, so to speak, you can look at tools that are locally resident and do some specific things like a lot of those technical controls. They actually automate that for you rather than having to do some, running regedit and doing manual changes here. uBlock Origin is what we use here at Great Castle in terms of blocking all online advertising as well, and it's very, very effective. So a couple of final thoughts, and then we'll open it up for questions. In our experience, there is very little to be gained by paying ransom unless you are in a situation where the business decides that, economically speaking, there's too much risk in not paying the ransom. There's a couple of reasons. One is that recognize that after this incident, if it becomes public, there's going to be a lot of scrutiny and visibility to how you responded. So not just the fact that you were hit with ransomware, but what did you do about it? And so in some cases, we've seen organizations pay the ransom because they needed to be in a legally defensible position, and they needed to be able to say, basically, we tried every option to restore services for the good of our clients, for the good of our customers. And that story does play in some industries. The second would be that you run out of other technical options. If you don't have good backups, if you are incurring losses that are greater than what you think it might end up costing you to pay ransom, there's a financial consideration here as well. And most organizations today, if their network, computers, people are down, they're losing money, whether they know it or not. So that can be a motivator or a driver for paying the ransom. We should. This is really a situation where 2 years ago, when we first started seeing this, we thought it was ingenious. Now it's just kind of a pain, but it's been so effective that for sure it's not going away. And in fact, we believe that the next real wave of ransomware will be integrity attacks. So imagine that instead of a ransom note that popped up, and said, "Hey, listen, all your files are unavailable," right? So talk about confidentiality, integrity, availability. Instead of your files being unavailable, we've just simply changed some of them. We're not going to tell you which ones, but some of your patient records are wrong. Some of your bank account balances are wrong. We're not going to tell you which ones unless you pay the ransom. In some ways, that is far more scary and far harder to deal with than an availability-based ransomware attack. And so if you think about the technical, there's not much of a technical leap between what we're seeing in these variants today from how they might actually conduct an integrity attack as well. So that's a little bit scary to us. I don't think as an industry we're very well prepared for integrity attacks like that, and we know that ransomware is going to be here for a while. One more point here, I'll reiterate, this is a people problem. This is not about technology. It's not about your backups. It's not about access controls or encryption. This is about your people. And the vast majority of ransomware intrusions can be halted right at the email inbox. These things don't run by themselves. And again, ransomware doesn't just show up on your network. Your people are putting it there. And so an effective awareness campaign that results in meaningful, lasting behavioral change, that truly is the Achilles heel and the silver bullet in this whole conversation. One of our forensic investigators named Adam had this quote not that long ago, and it really sort of summed up what we're seeing, not just in ransomware, but in other types of malware and cybercrime as well, which is we're never surprised, but often shocked at how clever adversaries have become, and just some basic pivoting or these subtle enhancements they're interesting in a way that makes businesses in America look a little bit slow, and not from a cybersecurity standpoint, but rather that they have become established businesses, and they understand return on investment. And these organized, cyber criminal families and businesses, they understand return on investment better than some American CEOs. And so when you have motivators like that, and when you've got smart people who are, dedicated to a cause, you're going to continue to find innovative solutions, and that's what they call them. They don't call it ransomware; they call it innovation, and we're going to continue to see that. So I think it's important that for us, for our clients, and particularly if you're a member of the response team for your organization, that part of this, of course, is evangelizing the response process itself and building a capability, but also, and part of this is managing expectations and emotions, and things can get pretty ugly during an event like this. So let's not be surprised or shocked by these things, but rather it's time to start preventing. So last thing here, just one quick note, let you guys read this. But I think it's also important to not overreact to this. While ransomware is certainly an epidemic by any measure, most of this is just fundamentals, cybersecurity fundamentals, stuff we've been doing since the 70s, or stuff that's been available since the 70s. And if you're building an effective cybersecurity program based on your risks, based on your assets, things that are important to you and your business, your agency, your department, then most of this stuff is just a repeat and a rehashing of stuff that you've already heard. A couple of other resources here. Again, the slides will be available to everyone, so I encourage you to check a few of these things out. Most of these are either specific to ransomware or are generally things that we utilize from a response perspective. Last thing I'll mention, 25% of our business is response, and we guarantee every organization that calls us a maximum of a 60-minute response time. If you're on this webinar because you're looking for a response resource, we'd be happy to talk to you about our capabilities and what we could do to help you. So that's my story, and I'm going to stick to it. I'm going to hand it back to you, Steve, to see if there are any questions.
Okay, thanks, Reg. Very informative presentation, very interesting presentation. I'll just kind of start. You kind of started and ended with the criminal organizations, the criminal enterprises. So I was kind of amused, at the beginning while the incongruity of where you were talking about, the integrity of those organizations, the trustworthiness. Like I said, that part amused me, and then at the end, you start talking about their, the organizations, looking at the, the return on investment, and so I'm wondering, facetiously, we're gonna be seeing some IPOs for some companies doing, specializing in ransomware. So, like I said, that was
There's a real misperception about what hackers and cyber criminals look like today. But they put on a suit and tie and they go to work and they punch a clock. They have direct deposit and health benefits just like we do. It's organized business. This is not, teenagers in a basement with a hoodie and Jolt Cola. Those days are long gone. This is a multi-billion-dollar business, and it's well organized. In some cases, it's more organized than the economic ecosystem here in the States.
Sure. So I'm, curious. You kind of had like educational institutions and healthcare as two of the big target areas. So kind of one thing I'm curious about is like say an attack on some hospital. In a case like that, it seems like there could be the potential to put lives at risk and things of that nature. So as do you see differences in the handling or the way people react to a ransomware attack depending on the type of organization that they actually are?
Maybe not consistently. I think organizations react differently based on their awareness of the issue and their preparedness. That said, last year, September of last year with Hollywood Presbyterian, for the first time in a real, material way, we saw ransomware affect patient safety, patient lives. It was a life and death struggle there. And in healthcare, their business is saving lives. And so if you can compromise that process, you've created real physical impact from a cyber element. And so it is interesting. You don't have that same situation in other industries. Healthcare has been heavily targeted because our adversaries know that they don't have a choice. They need their data. If they don't want to end up with class action lawsuits and dead patients or injured patients, that they don't have a choice. And so they've definitely gravitated there.
Yeah. It seems like you said when lives are on the line. I know the advice is to not pay the ransomware, but in those cases, I mean, it may be they may be kind of between the proverbial rock and the hard place, and easier to pay and move on than maybe in some of those cases. So let's see. So we've got some questions from our audience. So one individual is wondering, could network segmentation and virtualization help to prevent ransomware in a Linux, Unix type environment?
Virtualization inherently doesn't prevent or promote ransomware. It depends significantly on the configuration there. So propagation typically happens through things like file shares. So regardless of whether your environment is physical or virtual, a bunch of virtual machines, won't have a lot to do with it. That said, in terms of restoration, a virtual environment, especially if you're using something like VMware where there are sophisticated cloning and restoration tools, it can shorten the overall incident life cycle. Does that help?
Sure. That was great. Thanks. So in your presentation, you had mentioned the Bitcoin and the fact that some of folks that are hit with this and asked to pay in Bitcoin may not be familiar with that. And so one of our questions was asking if you could elaborate about the cost and not being able to track the ransom money.
Believe it or not, Bitcoin is considered to be a system of very high integrity because it leverages blockchain technology. And so any of these cryptocurrencies, whether you trust them or not, they have a system of checks and balances. So there are ways to track your payment, and there are some assurances built into that system inherently. Now, the real issue is that if you ask the average CIO how to pay a ransom in Bitcoin, they don't know how to do it. They got to go do some investigation. They also don't realize that paying or even getting Bitcoin takes some time. It's not like PayPal where you can just convert a credit card or a bank account into cash immediately. That's just not how it works. There's also typically some latency on the payee side. So if you are paying the ransom, let's not forget that these folks are working 9-to-5 jobs, and they're not checking their email in the middle of the night, and they're halfway around the world. So if you're paying a ransom during the day, conceivably it could be several days before you receive any response or keys or any type of relief there as well. It's not an instantaneous process.
Okay, thanks. It was that's interesting. That's interesting as well. So, see, one of our attendees was wondering if there's any empirical data available regarding the number of organizations that pay the ransom and are successful in doing that versus unsuccessful in that process.
I don't have statistics from our cases because we've never paid a ransom, but there are some obvious and very highly visible cases where the organization opted to pay the ransom and they got keys and they decrypted and they were back in business in a short period of time. It does work sometimes. The reality is, again, as I mentioned earlier, that there's a sort of a very strange sense of integrity in cybercrime today, and that it's a business. They want you to come back. They want you to be a repeat customer, and they want you to trust them. And so if you were to pay a ransom, and if they said, hey, listen, sorry, we're not giving you the keys, thanks for the money, you inherently have less trust in the system, and you're less likely to pay the ransom next time. They want repeat customers. So if you pay, I give you keys, you decrypt, you're back in business. So next time I do it, when I request a ransom again, you're going to pay because you trust me. And it's sort of a very weird thing to talk about, but trust and integrity in cybercrime is a trend. We're definitely seeing some of that.
So if somebody gets hit with a ransomware, and they go through the process and they recover, what do you have any information like on the possibility or like folks getting reinfected, kind of like you said, they coming back again?
Well, the likelihood of reinfection I don't think is any greater necessarily. That said, I will oftentimes, maybe the majority of times that we're in there responding to a ransomware issue, we find lots of other problems, other compromise. We've shown up to deal with ransomware and found intruders actively logged into compromised accounts that had completely unrelated. And so this is really about building a risk-based cybersecurity program that is resilient and not necessarily focused just on ransomware, but focused on early detection of anomalies and prevention of things where that's possible, and a response capability. This is going to be something else tomorrow. So let's not get too hyper-focused on ransomware and get distracted from the real goal.
Okay. Let's see. Let's see. So there's a question on level of attacks on individual records. We have any information regarding that?
Levels of attacks, and I'm not sure I understand the question, but that's not something that we typically track, meaning the work that I did, or that was done, I suppose, for this presentation was a little bit of, we'll call it heavy lifting, but a little bit of brute forcing, meaning we don't maintain a database of who's been hit by ransomware, how many endpoints were affected, that kind of thing. I'm sure it's out there somewhere, but I can't speak to the sort of the statistical differences between a single record or a single end user, like a home user, versus a business. And so I know the numbers are big, I just don't know what they are.
Okay, and we're kind of getting to the end of the session here. We did have a question come in from one of our viewers via our YouTube channel, and they have a question about you know, do you have any advice, technical solutions for home users, you know, backing up their systems, you know, anything a kind of a, you know, an individual at home should do as opposed to a, you know, a business?
Yeah, for home users, because there's a certain level of sophistication that's missing there, typically, a straight-up backup, a regular backup of their documents, and something that's offline. So either a hard drive that you can unplug, that you back up once a week or once a month, or you're using something like Carbonite. I'm not recommending Carbonite, by the way, but something like that where it's offline and inaccessible to any standard executable in the operating system. So, but that can be very simple.
Okay, no, that's great. Like I said, just you know, wanted to get some advice out there for the folks at home as well, and you know, those are good points. So, like I said, we are kind of at the end of our time for today's webinar. Reg, once again, I do want to thank you for taking the time to share share your information and your expertise with us. It's you know, a hot topic right now, and we appreciate you you know, enlightening us on this subject.
Great. Yeah, anytime. Thank you, everyone, for your time today.
Okay. Well, thanks, everybody. You have a good day, and we'll hopefully see you next month. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.